On the morning of June 28, 1914, a 19-year-old named Gavrilo Princip walked into a delicatessen in Sarajevo and ordered a sandwich. He had failed his mission. The assassination attempt on Archduke Franz Ferdinand had gone wrong. The bomb his comrade threw had bounced off the royal car and exploded under the wrong vehicle. Princip had given up. He was eating a sandwich, and then, by one of history's most astonishing accidents, the Archduke's car took a wrong turn and stopped directly in front of the delicatessen where Princip was standing. Princip stepped forward, raised his pistol, and fired twice. Within 6 weeks, those 2 bullets had triggered a war involving 30 nations, 70 million soldiers, and the complete destruction of 4 of the world's greatest empires. Within 4 years, the 20 million people were dead, but here is the question that haunts historians to this day. Did those 2 bullets cause the First World War? Or were they simply the spark that ignited a fire that had been building for decades across the entire continent of Europe? This is the story of why World War I happened. The rivalries, the empires, the arms race, the miscalculations, and the catastrophic failure of leadership that turned one assassination into the deadliest war the world had ever seen. And by the end of this video, you will understand that World War I was not an accident. It was the inevitable result of choices made over 50 years by the most powerful nations on Earth. To understand why World War I happened, you must first understand what Europe looked like in 1914. On the surface, it was the most powerful, most prosperous, most interconnected civilization in human history. European empires controlled 84% of the globe. European science was transforming medicine, physics, and engineering. European cities were electrified, telephoned, and linked by railways and steamships to every corner of the earth. Beneath the surface, it was a continent sitting on a powder keg, and everyone could smell the gunpowder. The 5 causes an overview. Historians have debated the causes of World War I for over a century, but at its core, 5 forces had been building since the 1870s that made a major European war not just possible but almost inevitable: militarism, alliance systems, imperialism, nationalism, and the spark, the assassination in Sarajevo. Let us take each one in turn. By 1914, the major European powers had been engaged in one of the most terrifying arms races in human history. Britain and Germany were locked in a naval rivalry that consumed vast national wealth and filled both populations with fear and suspicion. When Britain launched the HMS Dreadnought in 1906, a battleship so advanced it made every other warship in the world obsolete overnight. Germany immediately began building its own. Britain built more. Germany built more. On land, Germany, France, Russia, and Austria-Hungary had each built armies of millions of men. Conscription, compulsory military service, meant that an entire generation of young men across Europe had been trained for war. Generals had developed detailed war plans, timetables for mobilization, strategies for attack. The German military had a plan called the Schlieffen Plan, a blueprint for fighting a 2-front war against France and Russia simultaneously. It was precise, it was rehearsed, and it required Germany to attack France through neutral Belgium within days of any conflict beginning. The armies of Europe were like cocked guns, loaded, ready, waiting for someone to pull a trigger. By 1914, Europe had divided itself into 2 armed camps, connected by a web of alliances so tangled that a conflict between any 2 nations would automatically drag in all the others. On one side, the Triple Alliance, Germany, Austria-Hungary, and Italy, bound by treaty to defend each other if attacked. On the other, the Triple Entente, France, Russia, and Britain, linked by agreements forged out of shared fear of German power. These alliances were meant to provide security. If you attacked one of us, you attacked all of us. Mutual deterrence, a guarantee of peace. Instead, they created a mechanism for turning any local conflict into a continental war. A quarrel between Austria-Hungary and Serbia would pull in Russia, which would pull in Germany, which would pull in France, which would pull in Britain. The alliance system did not prevent war. It guaranteed that when war came, it would be total. The European powers were not just competing in Europe, they were competing across the entire planet. The scramble for Africa in the 1880s had divided an entire continent between European empires in less than 2 decades. Britain, France, Germany, Belgium, Portugal, and Italy drew lines across the African map with no regard for the peoples who lived there. But Africa was not enough. European nations clashed over Morocco in 1905 and again in 1911. They competed for influence in the Ottoman Empire, in Persia, in China. Everywhere there were resources or trade routes, there were European flags and European rivalries. Germany in particular felt cheated, a late arrival to the imperial game. It watched Britain and France grow fabulously wealthy from their overseas empires and demanded its own place in the sun. Kaiser Wilhelm II the erratic, insecure, and deeply dangerous German emperor was determined to make Germany the dominant power in Europe and the world. The competition for empire had been filling Europe with resentment, rivalry, and the near-constant threat of military confrontation for 40 years. Perhaps the most explosive force in early 20th century Europe was nationalism, the idea that every people, every culture, every ethnic group deserved their own sovereign nation. It was an idea that threatened to tear apart the great multi-ethnic empires of Europe, particularly the Austro-Hungarian Empire, which held together dozens of different peoples: Czechs, Slovaks, Poles, Croatians, Romanians, Bosnians, under the rule of the Habsburg dynasty in Vienna. And it was an idea burning most fiercely in the Balkans, the violent, contested, crumbling southwestern corner of Europe where the Ottoman Empire was retreating and new nations were being born in blood. Serbia, a small, fiercely proud nation that had won independence from the Ottomans, dreamed of uniting all South Slavic peoples under one flag. A greater Serbia, it looked at Bosnia-Herzegovina, controlled by Austria-Hungary but filled with Serbian-speaking people, and it wanted it back. Austro-Hungary looked at Serbian nationalism and saw an existential threat to its very existence. If the Serbs could inspire the South Slavs to revolt, who else might follow? The Czechs? The Poles? The entire empire could unravel. The Balkans had already produced 2 wars, minus 1912 and 1913, that had reshaped the map of southeastern Europe. Every major power was watching. Every major power was afraid. And every major power had chosen a side, which brings us back to Sarajevo and to a 19-year-old with a pistol and a failing mission. Archduke Franz Ferdinand was the heir to the Austro-Hungarian throne. He was visiting Sarajevo, the capital of Bosnia, on a day that could not have been more politically charged. June 28th was the anniversary of the Battle of Kosovo, the most sacred date in Serbian national memory. The Black Hand, the Serbian nationalist secret society with connections to Serbian military intelligence, had sent 7 assassins to Sarajevo to kill him. The first attempt failed. The bomb exploded under the wrong car. The Archduke drove on, and then came the wrong turn. The car stopped. Princip fired. Franz Ferdinand died with his wife Sophie within the hour. In Vienna, shock turned rapidly to fury. This was not just a murder. This was Serbia reaching into the heart of the Austro-Hungarian Empire and pulling the trigger. Austro-Hungary would not let it pass. It could not let it pass. Not if it wished to remain an empire. What followed the assassination is known to historians as the July Crisis, 5 weeks of diplomatic failure, miscalculation, and fateful decisions that transformed a Balkan murder into a world war. Austria-Hungary issued an ultimatum to Serbia, a list of demands so humiliating it was designed to be rejected. Serbia accepted almost all of them. Almost Austria-Hungary declared war anyway. Russia, the self-declared protector of all Slavic peoples, began mobilizing its army to defend Serbia. Tsar Nicholas II, under enormous pressure from his generals, ordered the mobilization of the largest army in the world, minus 6 million men. Germany, bound by treaty to Austria-Hungary, demanded Russia stand down. Russia refused. Germany declared war on Russia. France, bound by treaty to Russia, began its own mobilization. Germany declared war on France and immediately activated the Schlieffen Plan, invading neutral Belgium to reach Paris quickly. Britain, which had a treaty guaranteeing Belgian neutrality, issued Germany an ultimatum: withdraw from Belgium. Germany refused. Britain declared war on Germany. In 37 days, a Balkan assassination had become the First World War. The catastrophic failure of leadership, could it have been stopped? This is the question that haunts the history of World War I. The answer, agonizingly, is yes. At multiple points in July 1914, Individual leaders had the power to pull back from the brink. Kaiser Wilhelm II briefly wavered. Tsar Nicholas II exchanged personnel telegrams with his cousin Kaiser Wilhelm, calling him Willie, signed Nicky, begging for a peaceful solution. Even the military planners knew that once mobilization began, it would be almost impossible to stop. But fear, pride, miscalculation, and the iron logic of the alliance system ground every peace effort to dust. Leaders who had never wanted a major war found themselves unable to prevent one. Generals who had spent decades planning for war were more than ready to fight it. On August 4, 1914, British Foreign Secretary Sir Edward Grey watched the lamplighters extinguishing the gas lamps outside his window in London as evening fell. He turned to a colleague and said, "The lamps are going out all over Europe. We shall not see them lit again in our lifetime." He was right. When the armies of Europe marched to war in August 1914, most soldiers and most of their leaders believed it would be over quickly. A short, sharp war. Over by Christmas, they could not have been more catastrophically wrong. The Schlieffen Plan failed. Germany did not knock France out in 6 weeks. Instead, the war on the Western Front, the line running from the English Channel through Belgium and France to Switzerland, froze into a system of trenches that would barely move for 4 years. In those trenches, men lived in mud, rats, and perpetual terror, artillery barrages that lasted days, gas attacks that dissolved the lungs, machine guns that could kill 1,000 men in minutes. The Battle of the Somme in July 1916 killed 57,000 British soldiers in a single day. The Industrial Revolution, the subject of our last episode, had given humanity the power to kill at industrial scale, and the generals of World War I used every machine at their disposal. By the time it ended in November 1918, 20 million people were dead. Another 21 million were wounded. The German, Austro-Hungarian, Russian, and Ottoman empires had all collapsed. The map of Europe had been completely redrawn, and the seeds of an even more catastrophic war had already been planted. World War I did not end with peace. It ended with a ceasefire built on humiliation and resentment that made another war almost mathematically inevitable. The Treaty of Versailles of 1919 forced Germany to accept sole responsibility for the war, pay crippling reparations, surrender vast territories, and dismantle its military. The German people, who had not fought on German soil, could not understand their defeat. They had been told they were winning. Now they were told they were guilty. In the Middle East, Britain and France carved up the remains of the Ottoman Empire into new states, drawing borders with rulers and maps, with almost no regard for the ethnic, religious, or tribal realities on the ground. Lines drawn in offices in Paris and London created the Iraq, Syria, Lebanon, and Palestine that the world still struggles with today. In Russia, the war had destroyed the Tsarist regime. In its place rose the Bolsheviks, Vladimir Lenin, and the Communist Party, igniting a revolution that would define the 20th century. And in Germany, bankrupt, humiliated, and furious, a political movement began to grow in the beer halls and streets of Munich, a movement that promised to restore German greatness, to undo the shame of Versailles, to find someone to blame. 20 years after the guns fell silent on the Western Front, the world would go to war. Again, larger, deadlier, more monstrous than anything that had come before, because World War I did not end war. It made the next war inevitable. Today, in Sarajevo, there is a small museum on the corner of Franz Josef Street. It marks the exact spot where Gavrilo Princip stood on the morning of June 28, 1914. He was 19 years old. He wanted to free his people. He believed he was striking a blow for justice. What he actually did was pulled the thread that unraveled the world. Not alone. He had help. Decades of militarism, imperial rivalry, alliance building, and nationalist fury had loaded the gun. Princip merely pulled the trigger. The lesson of World War I is not that one man, or one nation, or one mistake caused the worst disaster in modern history. The lesson is that systems, political systems, military systems, alliance systems can develop a momentum of their own, a momentum that individual leaders cannot stop, even when they desperately want to. The lamps went out all over Europe in August 1914, and by the time they came back on, in November 1918, the world that had existed before was gone forever. World War I ended in 1918. The peace that followed lasted exactly 21 years. Because the Treaty of Versailles had not ended the conflict, it had simply postponed it. And in the ruins of a humiliated Germany, a man was rising who had learned every lesson of the First War and was determined to finish what it had started. Next time on the Historical Channel, why World War II happened. Hitler's rise, the failure of appeasement, the Holocaust, the turning points that decided the fate of civilization. Subscribe now and do not miss it.